This is the Fat Loss Pro Podcast.
Fat Loss Pro Podcast.
Discover what's needed to burn, build, and shape the body you want. You'll walk away knowing what you need to do to create results now. Chris DeFay is the authority on fat loss and getting you in shape. Cutting edge, results-based info from the world's best that unveils the curtain to quicker, simpler, no-nonsense fat burning, muscle building, and quality health.
Welcome to the Fat Loss Pro podcast. I am the Fat Loss Pro, Chris DeFay, and I'm quite delighted that today I am able to unveil some of the curtain and explore food addictions, eating disorders, and binge eating disorders with Vera Tarman. This is a world that I think needs to be opened up for the health and fitness world, as often I see people falling by the wayside and losing their happiness. I'm not going to spoil what I have in store with this chat Vera and I had, but this is something I know you're going to be able to walk away with being able to help yourself. As Vera touches on the swing of the pendulum of what food addiction and eating disorders are, that I know the health and fitness world will resonate with. I know I'm taking away a lot with this, and also the chat that Vera and I had before and after this is really going to help not only myself, but also especially the clients that I work with. Now, before I hit play on this interview, I want to give a shout out and a big thank you. Now, this is a 5-star review that I'm going to read out as when they come through on iTunes, and this is by Tiana. It reads, informative, easy to understand, and so helpful. A podcast made by people who know what they're talking about. Every episode is so informative in easy to understand language and full of variety. So happy I subscribe to this, makes my commute to work a lot more enjoyable, which I love. So thank you so much, Tiana. This absolutely gave me a huge buzz when I saw this, and I really appreciate the positive feedback. I also know how great it can be to have some quality audio to listen to when you've got to go through a commute or even get a bit of cardio done. Now, if you want to leave me a review and also get the show notes, links, diets, and more, I have them all on there for you with www.chrisdufay.com. I also want to say a big thank you for plugging me between your ears. The constant growth of the Fat Loss Pro podcast is phenomenal, and having you share the content only concretes in me wanting to produce and publish this content more to deliver the no-nonsense quality advice needed. Alright, let's get into the juicy stuff that you're here for and get into the interview with Vera. Vera, thank you so much for taking your time out and coming on with me for the Fat Loss Pro podcast. This is a really important topic that I want to cover and sort of unveil, especially to the health and fitness world. So this was a big reason why I wanted to get you on, and you're doing some great work in this field. So before we kind of delve into our chat together and all the questions that I've got ready to start firing along, I'd love for you just to give a bit of a background on who you are and why you're so fantastic.
Okay, well, what I am is an addictions doctor. I've been doing work in addictions for probably 20 years, and I work at 3 or 4 different treatment centers, seeing basically people in new recovery. And I've always had an interest in this area because I've had my own personal experience, as probably every woman in the world has. But what I saw when I was working professionally was that people were coming in, putting down their alcohol, putting down their cocaine, putting down their methamphetamine, and all of a sudden, not all of a sudden, but to their dismay, were eating way more than they did even before they picked up their drugs. And it just seemed, and it was with the same kind of behavior as they exhibited with their drug use. And it just, to me, because I started looking for that, it just seemed like such an obvious connection to say, look, we can use food in the same way as we use drugs. And people would say, yes, it's the same. And in fact, they would say it was harder to quit. So when I had this experience repeatedly, like I see probably 1,000 new clients a year because I'm working at various treatment centers, and I haven't done a research project per se, but I would say from a sort of gut estimate, I'd say probably 40% of people complain about their inability to manage their eating because they're gaining weight. And of course they're going to gain weight if they put down their drug, just because a lot of those drugs are appetite suppressants. Mm-hmm. But it's beyond that.
What would food addiction be like? What would be the definition that you would give it for the listener?
Well, it's an interesting question because, first of all, it's not an official diagnosis. It's not an official definition, right? And you mentioned earlier in our conversation about eating disorders. It's definitely, although I think that there's a huge overlap, it's not an eating disorder. So when we talk about things like bulimia and binge eating disorder, which I bet you see a lot of, especially binge eating disorder, I'm not saying that everybody who fits that category is a food addict. But when I'm talking about food addiction, I'm talking about somebody who has lost the control over not all food, but particular foods. And of course, what's the big one? It's almost always sugar. And then sorry, did you want to say something? I'm just rabbiting.
No, go for it. That's great. You're hitting the nail on the head, because it was true. Just before I hit record, we were talking about how the health and fitness industry probably does have such a big impact in eating disorders. And obviously you just touched upon it then as well. The binge eating disorder is something that is really prevalent, but keep going. It's fantastic.
And I mean, I'm sure that you also see a lot of anorexic behavior too, like people who are trying to restrict not only eating, but also, really excessively exercising. But even in that crowd, I think that there's probably a huge overlap with food addiction. So what I define as food addiction, and I want to stress, it's not an official diagnosis.
Yeah.
The DSM-5, which is I don't know what I don't know what you guys use. I think you probably use a more international reading, but you know what the DSM-5 is, because it's the big thing that, research programs, et cetera, that use it. But, when that just came out this year, we were all hoping that food addiction would be included, but it wasn't. The only thing that was added was binge eating disorder. But what we would call it sort of, I would say under the table, but, the people who are working in the field is a behavior, or a person who's exhibiting behavior that is basically showing lack of control. We have characteristics that we define as addiction. And if they are behaving in ways that would fulfill those criteria, then I'd say that person's a food addict. And I can give you what those criteria are if you like.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I'll just quickly jump in, because I think it's an important thing for the listener to grab, because you said it's not an official diagnosis, but I think as a lot of things, especially in the health and fitness world, it's not exactly black or white. There's a lot of a grey area that's a continuum, and obviously we want to try and see where the severity is from the swing from one side to the other.
Absolutely. And, just like a person who abuses alcohol or even cocaine, not everybody is an alcoholic, even if they're a heavy drinker, right? Like we would say that probably, I think it's probably underestimated, but, the official estimates for alcohol are like 10% of people are alcoholics. I think that at the most it would be, even if we were underestimating that number, it wouldn't be more than 20%. So food addiction, I'm not saying everybody who eats too much is a food addict. We don't have numbers, but we think it's somewhere between the 5 and 10% mark too. Looking at people who are obese, though, probably a lot more, like probably in the 30 or 40% range. This is not science. This is not research. This is just our gut or clinical experience.
Yep.
Okay, but getting back to the definition, here it is. It's the ABCDEs of addiction that we just apply to food. So if the person is unable to abstain when they say that they want to, like I'm going to stop, I'm not going to eat those chocolate cheese, whatever it is, but they find that they're slipping back later on that night, they're going to have it when they have their weak moment, because, there's a time with addiction, almost always there's a time when you have your weak moment. If you're unable to abstain, that's check number 1. B is behavioral control. You say you're going to have just a couple or 3 or 4 or 5, and you find that you don't have just a couple, you have more than that. 3, cravings, if you have cravings. And even if a person goes on a diet and they don't eat, we have what's called binge addiction too, like the alcoholic who ties one on every 3 months, loses their license, loses their job. I mean, they're just they run more risk of death and accident than the daily user of alcohol. So similarly with food, if the person is craving, obsessing, thinking about it all the time, even if they're not actually eating it, that's a mark there. That's another check mark. Like the person who, I'm only going to eat on Saturdays, and then I'm going to really pig out, but they're thinking about it the whole time. That's not a normal eater.
I just want to say, Vera, I think this is going to be resonating with a lot of people listening, because especially in the health and fitness world, it's kind of like, okay, I'm going to eat well for, say, 6 days a week, and then 1 day a week I get my, say, cheat meal. But I see the problem with that is there's such a good food, bad food mentality behind that, and they're constantly looking forward to that cheat meal. And and you've just pointed out, it's one of those check boxes that is part of a big problem.
Yeah, it's the obsession. So if a person can do the cheat meal and they're not obsessing about it the whole week, I'm going to call them a food addict, even if they eat too much. It's that obsessional piece, like where it dominates your thinking. So that's check mark number 3. Then there's the D, because we're doing the ABCDEs. So D would be either denial or diminishing of the consequences. So okay, I've gained 20 pounds. Oh my God. Well, I really have to stop. But when I hit 30 pounds, then I'll stop. When I'm diabetic. And then what happens when the person becomes diabetic? When I'm insulin dependent diabetic. You see what I mean? Like you always, whatever the what we call hidden bottom, whatever the bottom is, suddenly there's a deeper bottom that you're willing to go to. So there's a denial or a diminishing of the consequences that would make a regular person say, okay, that's it, I got to stop. But they can't stop. So that's D. And then the last one, E, would be the emotional relationship. Well, it's just emotions in general, and it's broken up into 2 pieces. And one is, people will often talk about, alcohol is their best friend. If you just have to scratch under the surface and ask somebody about their nightly eating habit, and if you take that away from them, they might say, that's more important to me than seeing my husband, taking away that Haagen-Dazs at night in front of the TV or something. Like, it's like it's like, that's my best friend. That's my thing I depend on. You know what I'm talking about. It's that emotional connection to this food object, which is not normal.
I think it's a really good point, because I think food, as in the fabric of society, like all celebrations are surrounded by food. It's the cake for your birthday, or it's the Christmas ham, or all those kind of things that come into play with it. But obviously, I think people are looking far too much to get happiness out of food, where really it's just a nourishing ingredient to your body.
Right. Well, more than happiness, just companionship. I need this to survive the night. Like, I've seen people, when they go home, they discover there's nothing in the fridge, they will drive across and usually people have their favorite item, whatever it is, the item of the month. They will go across town in rain, in snow to get that item. But would they go and see their sick friend? Probably they'll, can I go tomorrow, kind of thing. It's different.
Great point. That's really good. Okay, this is good. I'm very excited with this. So let's touch on the leptin insulin angle to food addiction.
Yes. Okay. So, the thing is here's where I don't know, we're dealing with a phenomena, hormones and cravings and all this kind of stuff, which is not necessarily addiction itself. Like, when we look at leptin and we look at ghrelin and we look at all of these hormones, which are connected to dopamine, and as I think you've mentioned in other podcasts, I think your readers or listeners rather are aware of the sort of connection of dopamine and the reward center and the cycle. And we know that when leptin is high and the person they're not leptin resistant and they're responding to their leptin, it blunts the dopamine in this so that the pleasure of eating is not as much. Wow. And when they're hungry, their ghrelin is high and their insulin is high because it needs to be to put in that sugar. Their dopamine is spiked. Like, it all works together, right? And if a person's diet, isn't following a low carb diet, is already out of whack, they're going to act like a food addict, even if they're not. That's why I think that some of this discussion that we're having can be appropriate to people who are following a low-carb diet, even if they're not a food addict, because there's a blending. It's like a social drinker, heavy drinker, alcoholic. Where's the difference? I don't know really where the difference is, except that it appears that some people can't go back once they've cottoned on to what their issue is. I'm going to give you an example because I think I had said to you when we were preparing this talk that there was a fellow in one of your previous podcasts that talked about the importance of willpower.
Yes.
And he was saying skill power. Yeah. And I was thinking, okay, that's fine for your heavy eater, like heavy drinker, but it's not going to work for the food addict because they've crossed over a line where the wiring in the brain, the dopamine connections have sensitized to the point where they just have to pick up one piece of chocolate, one piece of whatever, and they're off to the races. They can't go back, just like the crack addict can't just have one little toot on the weekend.
Yeah, that's a great point. So there's obviously it comes to the point where a straw breaks the camel's back.
Yes, that's right.
How do you know if you're borderlining going to that area?
It really, that's the good question. So, how do we know? Ideally, what would be really nice is if we could do PET scans and measure receptor sites and whatnot. Because, it's like a person who's diabetic. Their insulin receptor sites are blunted. And will they ever, once they're at a proper weight, my guess is that once a person has crossed over, they're always going to be pre-diabetic and just waiting. The diabetes is waiting to come back, even though it's under control. I don't really know. You're asking a question that we don't know, but one of the things that we clinicians who work in the area of food addiction say is, just like with any addiction, go out and if you can have a couple and stop, then you haven't reached that line. But the people who are food addicts, once they have their little bit of chocolate, like that cheat thing, the cheat meal, they might be fine that weekend, but they're already starting to think about the next weekend on Wednesday. And then the week after that, now they're thinking about it on Monday. And it only takes a few weeks before the whole thing kicks into gear. And that's compared to somebody else who is able to do the cheat meal. So sometimes you won't know until you actually try. And the food addiction community, the people who say that they are food addicts say, I know right from the get-go I can't even have one because what's going to happen? Yeah. The whole thing starts up again.
That's great. Okay, that's really good. So what's also why do people eat when they're not hungry? Like, what are the mechanisms behind that?
Well, I mean, if we just look physiologically, it may well be that it's because they're trying to match a deficiency. Like, I can't say that kind of dimension doesn't exist. I think it probably does. So if they're not eating enough carbs, there's probably something that's saying, I need some carbs. Like, I do think that some are important. And similarly with fats, there's probably some element of that. And it could also be that their hormonal system has been abused over the years of dieting and overeating, that's going to, without even introducing the dimension of food addiction, I think that we could be looking at issues right there about why people eat when they're not hungry. I mean, the hormonal, neurochemical, just food itself, the kind of food that we buy is made so that we eat more than we should, right?
Yes.
Intentionally to eat more.
Can you give an example of that? Does that go down to like having the right sort of proportions of fat and sugar together and how they can also become an addictive substance?
Yes, I think so. Absolutely. Yes. And what type of fats and what type of sugars and the whole glycemic index thing and how it's going to break down and all that stuff. And I do think that there's an element of individuality there that some people can get away with more than others. And that's probably got to do with, what they were born with. Some people are more insulin sensitive than others. Some people are more dopamine receptor sensitive. Like, when we talk about the biology or the genetics of addiction, we're actually looking at receptor sites. And what we're actually looking at is not entirely clear, but it appears to be that the dopamine 2 receptor sites, that's one area that people are really interested in looking at. That there's an abnormality or between people who are more likely to be alcoholics, and we see the same abnormality with cocaine, and we see the same abnormality with obesity. So, they're coming to the table. Those are individuals who are primed already to become addicted to something.
Sorry, I'm just having a thought. Is it mainly dopamine when it comes down to addiction? Because obviously the body's getting that feel-good reaction from the substance?
Well, that's the one that we really look at, but it's not only dopamine. I'd say that that's like the father or the mother of them all, because even the other neurochemicals like serotonin and endorphins, they couple with dopamine too. So that would be the main one, but the others are there too. And, when we talk about sugar being an analgesic, then we're looking at the opiate-like quality, or wheat being like an analgesic quality. We're looking at the opiate-like quality, which goes to the endorphins.
That's great. There's such a similar correlation between food and drugs, and obviously people are using food as their drug.
Yes.
But I think, as you said before, it was primarily the sugar was the main culprit of it. And why do you think that is? Like, firstly, let's go, why do you think it's sugar? And then obviously, what can we do about it?
Well, sugar, it's been investigated a lot. It's interesting how much I've seen studies on fat and I've seen studies on salt, but sugar it covers all of them. I mean, it increases the dopamine, it increases endorphins, it increases serotonin, it covers all bases, all the same bases as alcohol does, for sure. So it's been investigated the most, so we know a lot about it. When I look at stuff like fats, a lot of this research is still at the experimental stage. Like, we're not even really looking at people yet. We're looking at rats, right?
Yep.
And then I remember seeing a study that was actually quite well known, talking about rats and fat. And I looked at the actual stuff. I got the actual study, and I looked and I tried to determine what the composition of the rat chow was that they were choosing, and it was sugar and fat. It wasn't specifically fat. So I don't actually know how addictive fat alone is. I don't know if we know that, because we haven't been so clean in our research yet. And similarly with salt. If I answered your question, I feel like I've digressed.
No, that's great. I think the tangent is definitely needed with it as well. But I think what we can touch on now is, firstly, what's standard practice for food addiction?
Oh, well, it's standard practice is you got to quit the sugar. See, the thing is sugar, well, we know the brain needs sugar or it needs ketones, but I mean, sugar is, it's a fundamental, if we don't eat it, our body's going to make it. Like sugar is really important. One of the things I have people say to me all the time is, okay, food addiction, what's the treatment then? You want me to stop eating? I say, no, I don't want you to stop eating. I want you to stop eating particular foods like sugar and all of the white starches that basically are sugar in 5 minutes of metabolism. Because we see that the boost of dopamine is, we're not talking about the sugar of an apple, right?
Yes.
We're talking about the sugar of a Mars bar or something like that. And that type of sugar has gone, it's exceeded my body and your body's ability to say no. Because one of the things about addiction is the alcoholic, the food addict, the whatever addict, the cocaine addict, at some point they're saying, for God's sakes, help me stop. I don't want to keep using. I hate how I feel. I haven't slept for 3 days, or I am so bloated that I've thrown up 4 times and I can't do it again. Yet I still want one more. Like they're screaming no, but the yes is way bigger. And that's the thing about sugar is the potency of it is the yes is bigger than the no. And that's, in a sense, that's the simple definition of addiction, is when your yes is bigger than your no, you're in trouble.
Yeah, that's good. So, okay, I think a lot of people are probably resonating with what we're talking about, especially with more of the eating disorders and especially the binge eating side of it as well. Are the treatments or what someone can do about it different?
Yeah, well, yes, it is. Absolutely. So what we would say in food addiction, I remember you asked me this question, what do you do? Well, we stop the offending drug, which is sugar, and anything that looks like sugar, like basically wheat, flour, then we start to look at what are the other potential triggers, because it depends on the person. Some people can't eat nuts, like cashews, or nuts. So, okay, buddy, you're not going to eat nuts because that your obsessional thinking has taken over, and that's all you're thinking about. You can't eat nuts. Sorry. Like, if you start to basically restrict all of the binge triggers, and in some cases, people will even, I know that some of your people, listeners are not going to like this, but in some cases, people will even weigh and measure food because quantity could be addictive. You can eat so many carrots, so many celery, so many whatevers. That's very healthy, but you want something in your mouth. You want to chew. You know that feeling of your chomping away, to the point where that's become an obsession. Well, then if you weigh and measure, it's like, okay, that's all I'm eating, whether I want more or not. And then eventually what happens, and this is the same with any addiction, is after 2 or 3 weeks, it's usually about 3 weeks actually, the desire to do that substance diminishes. You just got to get through that first 3 weeks.
That's really interesting. So, okay, so let's say this. I was previously taught, and you most definitely can shoot this down, but from a psychological standpoint, when I or someone else is coaching somebody, rather than just taking something away and just leaving that as a void, you try and replace it with something else. So rather than just try and say, okay, no more Mars bars, it's more like I try and replace it with something else. Can you expand on that?
Sure, absolutely. I mean, so it's like the same idea of, we're not saying you can't eat food. You just have to choose what's not a trigger. So in a case where you're actually coaching somebody, I'd say first of all, what are the trigger foods? You don't even have to ask about sugar. You can just assume that one and any of the white flours like bagels and pasta and all that stuff, and then find out what are some of the things that they can eat that they don't obsess about, that they still enjoy, like maybe an apple with some coconut butter on it or something like that. I mean, they're still pleasant things, but they're not, obsessional. But if they become obsessional, then they're off the list too. And you asked me earlier, what's the treatment like for, how is this, I'm going to just say this, what's the difference between what we're talking about, food addiction treatment versus binge eating disorder or an eating disorder per se? They will always say, we want you to learn to eat everything but in moderation. And this is the really key difference between food addicts and binge whatever, is that we say there is no such thing as moderation for the addict. But, just like the alcoholic, they can't drink alcohol anymore, but they can do all sorts of other things. You try to get them to encourage them to do other things, not drink other substances, not do other drugs, because really it just fires up the addictive pathway. But you get them to find other activities, and you can find other foods, getting back to food, that are pleasant but are not addictive. I'm sure like there's really delicious broccoli dishes and really delicious green bean dishes, whatever, that are fine.
Absolutely, yeah. If you eat it raw, it's like chewing on cardboard, but obviously if you make a bit of an effort, it's actually quite good.
Yes, and when you're done with it, you don't want more. You're thank you, that was really tasty, and I'm satisfied. Yeah.
Satisfied, yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we've touched before, and this was a really interesting point, that for food addicts, you found a really important part was introducing a low-carb, medium protein, high-fat type of diet.
That's
and
right.
Not also that works, but you also said, and you most definitely can correct me if I'm wrong, but you usually find that people that work well off that kind of diet actually have an addictive type of personality?
No, I don't think that they do, but I think it would work well for an addictive type of personality. I mean, I think it works well for anybody. Because, see, the thing is what we're trying to achieve, you and I, whatever our population is a person who's satisfied at the end. And the thing about food addiction is when a person is eating addictively, they're not satisfied at the end. They're just wanting more, but now they're so full that they can't have more. And they're frustrated and they're pissed off and then they're whatever. But what we're trying to achieve is I want to eat a meal and feel satisfied at the end. And my experience is that a low carb, moderate protein, higher fat is very satisfying. And as long as you don't have a trigger food hidden in there, you're not going to be going, oh my God, I want more.
I think it's a great point, because it's just a resounding common theme that we've had the entire time, that obviously, one, you need to keep, well, not your carbs low, but I think you can be much wiser with your carbs. And we've obviously discussed taking the white starches and the sugar out, having protein, but also having a good amount of fats. It's ticking the boxes on so many different levels.
Yes, that's right. And some people are different than others. Like some people can't have as many carbs as other people can. It's really then it boils down to. I mean, I do think that you're in a great position as a coach because you can actually ask people, okay, did you find that you were obsessing over this, or were you satisfied? If you're satisfied, great, go for it.
What about on the flip side, people trying to completely avoid having a bit of a splurge or having a little bit of sugar? Do you think there's a negative of people trying to say, for lack of a better way to say it, trying to eat too clean and they're trying to get a bit obsessive over it that way?
Sure, it's possible. Yeah, absolutely. I guess that's the danger of getting into this. It is. I don't know how to say this. It is the danger, but it is not a perfect situation here. If a person can get away with it, then go ahead. Like, not everybody's a food addict. Like, I mean, like I said, I have my own experience. I've learned that as much as I occasionally think, boy, it would be nice to have one of these Starbucks. You guys have Starbucks there, don't you?
Because I'm living in Bali at the moment, there are Starbucks here, yes.
All right. You know, whenever I look at some of those little treats, I go, oh, that would be nice, wouldn't it? And I think, no, it's not worth it. It's just not worth it. I'm going to have instead something else, which is just fine. And I don't feel deprived because I have enough other stuff, like you said, that's a substitute that's not obsessive making. My guess is that if a person has gone to the point where they're eating so clean that they're going too far, it means that they're losing their satisfaction, because food should be satisfying. It's just we don't want it to be addictive, compelling, so compelling that you can't stop. It is really a balance you have to find.
That's a really good point. I think it's probably the theme that we've been covering the whole time. It is, and unfortunately, it's not a very sexy term, but moderation is so key.
Yeah. Sorry, moderation is...
so key.
So, well, it's key, but I don't mean moderation in sugar unless you're not a food addict.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. No, I completely agree.
Yeah, like because it's like saying to a crack addict, it's okay to have a puff once in a while. And, you know, an addict will always, always, always want to hear that message. Except for the one who says, no, I don't want to go there anymore, because it's like an itch. You just start to scratch and then the itch is bigger. And each time you go there, it's bigger, and it's bigger, and it's bigger. Nobody wants that.
That's perfect. Vera, we've come up with time. You've done absolutely brilliantly being so generous with this information. I know a lot of people are going to take a lot away with this, and this is a topic that is very much needed to be expanded and explored in the health and fitness world. So thank you so much. But before I let you go, I'd really love you to be able to tell the listener how they can learn more about you, but also about the book as well.
Yes, that's good. Thank you. To find out more about me, I have a website. Please visit that. It's called addictionsunplugged.com, just as it sounds. And my book is called Food Junkies, The Truth About Food Addiction. You can already pre-order it on Amazon. And it's about exactly what we were talking about, food addiction. How do you know if you're a food addict? Some examples of like different stages of food addiction, what they look like, and also the treatment. So it sort of covers all of it, but I think in a pretty reader-friendly way. Like I give lots of case examples.
Excellent. All right. So just for the listener to know, I'm going to put all those links and the link to be able to pre-order the book as well in the show notes for you as well, Vera.
Great. Thank you, Chris.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for sharing everything that you've given and your time as well.
Okay. Thank you. I talked a lot. I hope you got enough in there yourself.
That was great. I've taken so much away.
Okay.
This has been another jaw-dropping podcast from the Fat Loss Pro, Chris DeFay. After subscribing to the Fat Loss Pro podcast,
go to www.chrisdefay.com
to get your free fat loss diet, training programs, insights, and more to burn fat faster and shape